A bear, a symbol of raw, untamed power, walked through the long, dry grasses under the Texas sun, gently cradling his cub. The warmth of the sun was a constant, a reminder of both comfort and suffering, beating down on the tin roof of an old warehouse. Inside, the suffocating heat was almost unbearable, and the silence that enveloped the abandoned space was broken only by the creaking of the structure, groaning under the weight of years and neglect. Detective Sarah Martinez stepped carefully through the warehouse, her boots crunching on the dust-covered floor. For a moment, the light from her flashlight flickered, casting elongated shadows that seemed to move like ghosts across the forgotten space. Sarah had faced many crime scenes in her career as a detective, each one more disturbing than the last. But nothing could prepare her for the horrors she was about to witness. The illegal bear farm had been operating secretly for years, hidden away in the desolate stretches of rural Texas, where the cries of suffering could be easily ignored, and the perpetrators could work in the dark without fear of discovery. As Sarah moved deeper into the warehouse, her flashlight beam cutting through the heavy darkness, she tried to steel herself for what was ahead. She had witnessed human cruelty in her career, but this was something else. The first few cages she passed were empty, their rusted doors hanging open like gaping mouths, silent witnesses to the struggle and desperation that had occurred within. But then, in the far corner, Sarah saw him. Bruno. The grizzly bear was crouched in a corner of a cage that was barely large enough for him to turn around. His once magnificent coat was dull and matted, patches of fur missing from where he had desperately rubbed against the unforgiving bars in a futile attempt to escape. His massive body was hunched in a way that suggested it no longer had the strength or will to fight back. Bruno's eyes, once sharp and full of intelligence, now reflected only a dullness that spoke of years of suffering. When the door to the warehouse creaked open wider, a small beam of light flooded the room, and Bruno recoiled, retreating further into the shadows. The light, which should have symbolized hope and freedom, was merely a source of further pain. For him, it was a painful reminder of everything he had lost. Officer James Thompson, who had been quietly documenting the scene, lowered his camera, his voice barely a whisper. "Jesus Christ, Sarah, how long do you think he's been here?" Sarah studied the scene with a trained eye, noting the signs of despair in the cage. The wear on the bars, the deep gouges that Bruno's claws had left in the concrete, the layers of filth that covered the ground, all signs of years of captivity. Her voice was thick with emotion, something she rarely allowed herself to feel on the job. "Too long," she murmured. "Far too long." The rescue operation that followed took hours. Bruno, though physically weakened, still retained the instincts of a wild animal, and every attempt to approach him was met with defensive growls and body language that made it clear he would fight to the very end if cornered. Dr. Rebecca Chun, a veterinarian present at the scene, worked with infinite patience, using a tranquilizer dart to sedate Bruno just enough to safely transfer him. The transport truck carrying the bear away from the warehouse signaled the beginning of a new chapter in his life. As Sarah watched the truck disappear into the distance, she couldn't help but think about the bear. She had seen victims of trauma before, people who had been subjected to unimaginable horrors, but Bruno's eyes told the same story. They reflected a soul that had given up on hope, that had learned not to trust or believe that anything good could come again. She hoped, deeply, that they could show him otherwise. That Bruno's new home was the Rolling Hills Wildlife Sanctuary, a sprawling 300-acre sanctuary nestled in the heart of Texas Hill Country. It was a place where animals who had been through hell could begin to heal. Michael Harrison, the sanctuary's director, had been running the facility for over 2 decades, having seen countless cases of abused animals. But when Bruno arrived, even his seasoned staff stood silent in awe. The enclosure prepared for Bruno's arrival was designed with care, offering plenty of space, natural shade from towering oak trees, and a small pond for bathing. But it was clear that no amount of comfort could ease the fear that had taken root in Bruno's heart. As they opened the transport cage, Bruno remained as far from them as possible, retreating into the corner of the enclosure and staying motionless, save for the tremors that ran through his body. His eyes, though dull, seemed to take in every detail of his new environment, but he showed no sign of acceptance. Henry Brook, a 73-year-old retired park ranger who had spent his life working with animals, saw something in Bruno's reaction that made him realize the depth of the bear's trauma. The enclosure, made of reclaimed pine lumber, carried the same musty scent as the warehouse where Bruno had spent so many years of his life. To Bruno, this smell was not one of refuge but a haunting reminder of his past. It was in that moment that Henry knew that Bruno's healing would take more than just food, water, and a safe space. It would take time, patience, and understanding. Henry began his healing process on the second day, when he made his first attempt to assess Bruno's condition. He leaned down to get a closer look, but as soon as he did, Bruno's response was immediate and violent. The bear's massive body shot up on his hind legs, growling with a force that shook the air around them. It was a clear sign of the fear that still consumed Bruno, a fear instilled by years of abuse at the hands of humans. Henry, realizing the severity of Bruno's trauma, sat back and began a new approach. He would become a constant, patient presence in Bruno's life, a figure that would slowly erase the fear of humans, bit by bit. Each day, he brought a simple wooden chair, positioning it at the same spot by the fence. He would sit there quietly, watching the trees, breathing slowly, letting Bruno adjust to his presence without the pressure of interaction. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Day by day, Bruno's fear began to lessen, though only slightly. His breathing slowed, his position became less tense, and the trembling that had plagued him for so long began to fade. One morning, Henry brought a soft cloth from his ranger days and placed it by the fence. Bruno stared at it for hours, unsure, fascinated. By the next day, the cloth had been moved to Bruno's corner, and he was curled up with it, holding it. As though it were a lifeline. One afternoon, during a violent thunderstorm, something remarkable happened. Henry, as always, sat by the enclosure, waiting out the storm with a thermos of hot tea. When Bruno emerged from his corner, he did not cower from the storm's fury as Henry expected. Instead, he sat upright, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something beyond the storm. In that moment, something changed. Bruno's eyes, once filled with only fear, now reflected curiosity, a flicker of the wild animal he once was. The storm passed, and Bruno's behavior began to shift. Henry began to bring small gifts, pieces of honeycomb, smooth river stones, and fresh salmon, to remind Bruno of his natural instincts. Each time Bruno interacted with these objects, it was a sign that he was beginning to reconnect with his wild side. His instincts, once suppressed, began to re-emerge. The real breakthrough came when Henry began to hum old cowboy ballads while sitting by the fence. Bruno, once terrified by every human sound, began to calm whenever the familiar songs filled the air. Bruno's trust grew, and their bond deepened. Henry had become not just a caretaker, but a friend. Winter came, and with it, new challenges. Bruno's recovery continued. As snow fell across the sanctuary, Bruno seemed to find peace in the quiet, cold beauty of the world around him. Henry, now a familiar presence, continued his daily routine, sitting by the fire with the bears, watching them interact with their new world that by spring, Bruno had transformed. He was no longer the broken, fearful animal who had arrived at the sanctuary. He had regained his strength, his coat now glistened in the sun, and the weariness had faded from his eyes. He had become whole again, a wild bear living freely in the sanctuary, learning to trust once more. But the real test of Bruno's transformation came when a female grizzly bear appeared on the sanctuary's perimeter. Bruno responded with excitement, and soon, he was interacting with the female bear, a sign that he was ready to return to the wild. The staff, led by Dr. Chun, began the process of preparing him for release. Bruno had earned his freedom, but it would be a gradual transition, one that would allow him to adjust to the wild once again, with the safety of the sanctuary nearby. And so, Bruno left the sanctuary, but he never truly left the people who had saved him. The bond between Henry and Bruno, built on trust, patience, and respect, endured. The sanctuary continued to be a place where Bruno and his family visited, leaving offerings for Henry, showing that their bond was not just one of survival, but of love and respect. As time passed, Henry's hair grew whiter and his movements slower, but he continued his vigil by the fence, always awaiting the visits from the bears. One winter morning, a photograph was taken of Henry sitting by the fire, with Bruno lying nearby, and Lucy playing with her cubs in the background. The photo became famous, not just for its beauty, but for the story it told. The story of healing, of the power of patience, and the unbreakable bond between a man and a bear. Henry knew that what he had witnessed was something extraordinary. The healing of a traumatized animal and the restoration of trust between two species that had once been separated by fear. And as he sat beneath the oak tree, where his chair had worn its familiar spot in the earth, Henry knew that the journey had not just been about rescuing a bear, but about finding redemption for them both.